Hello and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be taking a look at the Kansas gubernatorial race between incumbent Democrat Laura Kelly and Republican Attorney General Derek Schmidt, and why I think Laura Kelly is almost assured defeat in November. We'll take a look at previous election results in Kansas, as well as Kansas's politics as a whole, as well as another example to kind of indicate why I think this is going to be the case. Also, 2022 is not going to be a good year for the Democrats. Republicans are still leading the generic ballot by about 2 points or so, and that's even after all of the abortion stuff that happened about a month ago, which really hasn't changed the course of this midterm in any significant way. A lot of Democrats and even some Republicans thought that the Dobbs decision, the overturning of Roe v. Wade, would have a significant impact on the midterms, but that didn't seem to be the case and doesn't look like it's going to be the case in November. Only 8% of Americans on average, according to exit polls, actually vote on abortion as a number one issue. So it's really not a top priority for Democrats nor Republicans in the midterm election. So Republicans are still likely to have the energy, but I don't even think that's why Laura Kelly loses this race. I think she loses this race just because Kansas as a whole is an ancestral Republican state. If we take a look at the political breakdown of the various political offices in Kansas and the state legislature, overwhelming Republican dominance going all the way back to the inception of the state. It really does take a perfect scenario for Democrats to be elected in the state to begin with. If you want to go back on the presidential level, the last time Kansas voted for a Democratic nominee for president was back in 1964 with Lyndon Johnson, who had a total landslide across the country in 1964. And you have to go all the way back to FDR for the last time a Democrat won the state before Johnson. So that's 30 some odd years before 1964, and then of course 1964 was nearly 60 years ago at this point, the last time Kansas voted for a Democrat for president. And looking even at the recent statewide offices, Republicans dominate basically all of them except the appointed ones. Obviously the treasurer is an example, for instance, which Laura Kelly can appoint the treasurer, so that's really the main reason why Republicans don't hold this office. But the state legislature in particular, the last time you see Democrats having both chambers of the state legislature is back in 1914, 1913. And that was also the last time Democrats ever had a trifecta in the state of Kansas. So really over 100 years, Republicans have had some chamber of the Kansas government at some point in time. And looking back at 2018, this is a perfect example, I think, of a Democrat, really a perfect storm. For the Democrats, you had a blue wave year on the national environment overall, Democrats winning the generic ballot by about 9 points. Also, you had Chris Kobach, who was an incredibly weak nominee for the Republicans. Had the Republicans nominated just a generic Republican, for instance, I think this race probably would have been safe for the Republican Party, or a bit closer, maybe within 10 points, because Laura Kelly is not exactly a super liberal Democrat. She is still a Democrat and votes mostly in line with Democratic policy agendas, or at least she did in the Kansas State House, but she is definitely more of a moderate, and she has to be if she's governing a state like Kansas, which has obviously Republican control of both the state Senate and the state House, and she also wants to win re-election this year, which, as I outlined earlier, is going to be incredibly difficult in this midterm environment. So, you know, Kansas overall, again, Laura Kelly won by about 5 points back in 2018, mainly because Chris Kobach did so poorly in the urban and suburban counties here in eastern Kansas, places like Topeka, the Kansas City Metro, and even Wichita, which is generally a safe Republican area in other races. Also, Chris Kobach had weak turnout all across the state, not just in eastern Kansas, but also even western Kansas. A lot of these hardcore Republican counties where Republicans typically get 80, even 90% of the vote, Chris Kobach is only getting in the mid-60s, occasionally in the low 70s, which can't outvote the rest of eastern Kansas here. And if we go just down ballot, Derek Schmidt, the challenger to Laura Kelly, won by the largest margin of any candidate statewide in 2018. If we look at the other down ballot races, Secretary of State was decided by about 9 points. Treasurer was decided by about 17 points. So Derek Schmidt by far had the best showing of any candidate, Democrat or Republican, back in 2018. That in itself shows electoral strength. Even in a year where Democrats were doing pretty well across the entire country, Derek Schmidt was still able to win Kansas by almost 20 percentage points. And a lot of these counties where Chris Kobach was losing by 6 points, Derek Schmidt wins by, 17 or so. Topeka, where Laura Kelly was winning by about 24 points. Derek Schmidt wins by about 16 or so. So overall, I would argue this is enough to say that Derek Schmidt is a pretty strong candidate. Again, he's been in office for Attorney General since 2006, I believe he was first elected. So he's been around for a long time. He's certainly a household name in Kansas Republican politics. And that's why he's extremely favored in the Republican primary. There's really only Arlen Biggs, the other Republican in this primary, who's likely going to lose by a pretty large margin. Derek Schmidt has been a statewide official for an extremely long time. We really don't have any polling on the Republican primary. There's just this one poll from Signal, which really seems to be kind of a mess. I don't even think this guy, Jeff Collier, is even running. So really not a reliable poll overall. But Derek Schmidt will win the primary and end up facing off against Laura Kelly. And if we take a look at the general election polling, Derek Schmidt is ahead. Now, we don't really have a lot of polling out of Kansas to begin with, and two of these polls are from 2021. There's one, obviously, where Laura Kelly is leading by 3, but that was taken in September of last year. And, a poll from earlier that month had Derek Schmidt up by 4. And the most recent poll we have from April has Schmidt also up by about 4 points. So, ultimately, he's doing fairly well. Again, Kelly is an incumbent Democrat, and I think as the election season draws on, he's probably going to start leading the polls by a larger margin, although I wouldn't be surprised if Laura Kelly keeps the polling metrics somewhat competitive. I don't expect her to be down by 10 or 8 or even 12 points or anything like that. I think she keeps it within single digits, maybe 5 to 6 points she's down in the polling average, but I think ultimately her election performance in November is going to be a lot worse than that. We can take a look at a recent example where the polling also overestimated the Democrats, and that was back in 2020, the 2020 Senate race in Kansas, which, again, 2020 was a year where Democrats were winning the generic ballot by about 5 points. And after the poor performance of Chris Kobach, many Democrats saw a small chance to flip this Kansas Senate seat. Again, Pat Roberts, the former senator from Kansas, retired and kind of left this seat open. And he wasn't really a particularly strong candidate either. Back in the 2014 Senate election, I think he only won by about 10 points or so, despite it being a red wave year. But these polls had the Democrat, who was a former Republican, Barbara Bollier, I think that's how you pronounce her name. She was relatively competitive, and in some polls she was even leading or tied with Roger Marshall. But at the end of the day, Marshall ended up winning this race by about 12 points, 11 or 12 points or so. So, this race ultimately was not that close for the Democrats, despite the polling indicating it being as such. And I think that's just because Kansas as a whole is a much more difficult state to poll. Rural safe red states are usually very hard to poll because a lot of the Democratic voters are concentrated in just the urban centers, and really the rest of the state is solid Republican. Again, if you look at some of these rural counties, Derek Schmidt is getting 88% of the vote, 79% of the vote. Obviously, Laura Kelly is not going to do this bad as an incumbent governor. However, I wouldn't be surprised if the margin at the end of the day in this race was about a 9 or 10 point margin. I've had Kansas rated as likely Republican for a while, and I stand by that prediction. I don't think it's going to be necessarily safe. I think Laura Kelly does have some things going for her. She's not as left-wing as the National Democratic Party, but still, I think the 2022 midterm year alone is going to be enough to do her in. Now, one example where the Democrat in a safe red state actually won in recent history was back in 2019. Louisiana was a state that Donald Trump won by, I believe, about 18 points back in 2016, somewhere around there. He won Louisiana by a safe margin, and yet John Bel Edwards, the incumbent Democrat, won this re-election bid by about 3 points. So, Donald Trump had gone down to Louisiana and campaigned for Eddie Rispone, who I personally think wasn't the strongest nominee. I think Ralph Abraham, who was the other Republican, would have been a much stronger candidate and probably could have beaten John Bel Edwards. But nonetheless, John Bel Edwards still won this election by about 3 points. But keep in mind, this was a year where Democrats were doing better than Republicans. Obviously, the Democrats won in Kentucky. They flipped Kentucky. Again, Matt Bevin was one of the most unpopular governors in the country, but nonetheless, they flipped that seat very narrowly. They got pretty close in Mississippi. They ran a strong candidate, the attorney general in that state, who was a Democrat, Jim Hood. And then, of course, they won here in Louisiana. But this was at a point where Donald Trump was not popular on the national level. John Bel Edwards was a popular incumbent. And even despite all of those things going in his favor, Bell Edwards only wins by about 3 percentage points. Laura Kelly does not have any of those things going in her favor except the decent approval rating. Democrats are not expected to do well nationwide, and the incumbent president, who is a member of her party, is extremely poor in approval ratings. He's in the mid to high 30s. So really, those are pretty bad metrics going in as an incumbent Democrat. And like I said before, if we look just back at this table, Kansas is an overwhelmingly Republican state. And while it does have a history of occasionally, or even often sometimes, electing Democratic governors and re-electing them, I don't think that's the result we're going to see this cycle. This is a race where most of the polling companies have this as either lean Republican or toss-up. None of them have it in Laura Kelly's favor. Honestly, I think a lot of these ratings should be changed to at least lean or likely Republican. I don't think there's really a realistic chance that Laura Kelly can win this race because of the things I laid out. 2022 is not going to be a good year for the Democrats, and despite Laura Kelly's pretty decent approval rating, and it is in the mid 50s, the mid to low 50s, depending on the poll you look at, I don't think it's going to be enough to save her. Approval rating at the end of the day doesn't have the largest impact on politics, even good approval ratings. Mark Warner, for instance, in Virginia back in 2014, very, very popular incumbent senator. He almost lost despite him winning his last election by about 30 points in 2008. Approval rating tends to be more of a factor when the incumbent or the candidate is unpopular rather than popular. And Laura Kelly's approval rating is about average or a bit better, given the fact that she is running in a red state, but I don't think that outweighs partisan lean of Kansas as a whole and the Republican year. So overall, I think Laura Kelly loses this race by about 9 or 10 points. Anyway, guys, leave your thoughts in the comments down below. Like this video if you enjoyed, subscribe if you haven't already. And again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.